Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Jace Hardwick. He's a CEO, filmmaker, and content creator. On today's episode, you can expect to learn how the Bible made Jace a better storyteller, how his own screenwriting made him appreciate the Bible more, advice he'd give if you're an up-and-coming artist, how Jace got started down the artistic path himself, how he combines his faith and his art, if it's difficult working in LA as a Christian, and much more. I've had the pleasure to work with Jace a few different times, and I can honestly say he is such a genuine, hardworking, and inspiring guy. So without further ado, please welcome to the show, Jace Hardwick. Jace Hardwick, thanks for taking time to come on the show today.
Of course, thanks for having me.
So you're a filmmaker and content creator. Are those two good titles to start with?
I'll take those titles. Those are good.
All right. Filmmaker, content creator, based in LA. Can you share a little bit how you got into filmmaking in the first place? Because I don't feel like most kids, at least at first, are like, oh yeah, filmmaking. That's just not something that comes to mind.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. It's kind of like a multifaceted answer because I grew up playing sports and I was like, I'm gonna be a football player. And then I was like, I didn't get any taller or bigger, so that's not a career path. But I grew up with my sister who was in the industry, and she's a lot older than I am, and I was always like the little kid in her films. So I think that's where the bug got planted for me when it came to filmmaking. And then it was actually my English teacher in high school that allowed me to make videos instead of writing essays. That
Mm.
kind of also got me into filmmaking. It was like junior year, and she said, "Yeah, you could instead of writing an essay, you could go make a video." And I remember making the class laugh, and I was like, "Wait, I kind of like this thing." And then I was on student government in high school, and I kept getting asked to make videos for like the rallies and stuff like that, and just enjoyed making people laugh. So I think that's kind of where the bug started was like my sister and then making videos. And then me and my co-director Yo-Yo just kind of started doing the YouTube thing and really enjoying making comedy, but our stuff kept getting bigger and better and better. And it was like less YouTubey and more like cinema. And I think that's kind of was like the last little turning point before we became uh what starting our company now, which was Action Studios. And so that was kind of like the last saga before we started the company and started being like, okay, let's see if we can make some movies and short films. um yeah, so it's like kind of a multifaceted answer. I kind of like came into it slowly and then I went to school for it. And now we're
Yeah.
running the companies and doing what we're doing now.
Yeah. Cool. And can you talk a little bit more about what it is that you do now?
Also a multifaceted answer. We started Action Studios coming out of college from Biola. And we started with the intention of making like an entertainment company. And from there, it kind of split into a conglomerate company. That's the best way I can describe it. So Action Studios is an umbrella. And then we started an ad agency underneath that started to do advertisements, like comedy ads, like Super Bowl type style ads, as well as working with influencers. So we also started another company called Social Jump that started working with more like YouTube, Instagrammer type people. And I think right now we're in the middle of the process of starting with the entertainment section of our company, which right now we're calling it Studio 316. Um, where that's more of us trying to pitch movies and stuff like that. So that's kind of like the three buckets that our company is pushing right now.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Now, anyone that has done film or anything like film has like tried to cut together a YouTube video or anything like that will kind of know that um it appears all like glamour and glitter from the outside, but the like reality of day-to-day life of filmmaking can be kind of hard and arduous. When you wake up in your bed in the morning and you have a 12-hour set ahead of you, what gets you out of bed? What makes you excited?
I think just making the products. Um, I think when you're in filmmaking, you have to you obviously have to love it because at the start of it, you're not making a lot of money doing what you're doing, but you just love the craft of storytelling. And I grew up on like Lord of the Rings, Narnia, and like those types of books. And there's just something about wanting to tell stories that I feel like is so ingrained in us. And I just love that part. Like part of me is sometimes less of about going and shooting the thing and more about writing the thing.
Mm,
But when I get to wake up and go and shoot and get on production, that's kind of me being like, okay, I'm breathing life into this. So that's kind of the exciting part to me is taking something that was in my head and getting to actually be on set and basically go get to play pretend. It's like that's a pretty easy thing to wake up to go enjoy and do. So I think I think just like the love for the craft for sure. You have to love it. And I
mhm.
I just like making stories, making people laugh and trying to figure out new ways to like entertain people. Um, I don't know, it gets me up in the morning.
Yeah, yeah. Who do you draw inspiration from? What's your kind of like Mount Rushmore of people that inspire you?
Um, there's a few people. I mean Peter Jackson for sure was a big one. James Cameron was another one.
Mm,
And then Edgar Wright were probably my top 3 directors that I really, like, took inspiration from. Edgar Wright for his comedy and his timing, his editing. James Cameron because I wanna make big epics, and then Peter Jackson because he made Lord of the Rings, and then I just kinda fell in love with the other stuff that he did too, but his, like, eye for fantasy and world building was also something that I enjoyed, and his approach, besides James Cameron, were like 2 different ways of approaching big world building, and so I really
mm,
liked those 3. Um, yeah, at least from like a filmmaker standpoint, I think those guys are probably some of like the bigger ones, and then Freddie W. I grew up on Freddie W. on like YouTube, Freddie W.
yeah, totally.
Grew up on with him, and so he kind of inspired me to be a filmmaker, and so did Film Riot, and then Julian Smith were probably like the YouTube like era of filmmaking, mixed with the big directors that kind of got me into the styles that I like making are very much like if you go look at like those 6 people, the films that we make are very much like inspired by what they do. So I think those are my like probably my Mount Rushmore. If I was to sit in a circle with people, it'd be those guys.
Hmm. Yeah. I feel like having been, I mean, only a couple, but having been on a few of your sets and also having watched the other stuff, I completely see how that circle would like all coalesce into your
Yeah,
style. Yeah, that's very
that's my
cool.
creative. What do they call it? Your creative family tree. That's
Yeah,
my
yeah.
creative family tree.
That's a good like piece of terminology. Creative family tree. I like that. Um, for young men or women who are kind of growing up and are getting into the creative process, whether it's high school or college or younger, what's a piece of advice you might give to them, whether they want to do filmmaking or YouTube or painting? What would you recommend?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I don't know. I think when you're younger, exploring a bunch of different things is definitely big. I wish when I was in college, at least, that I made more stuff.
Hmm.
Advertisements, short films, comedy, try doing vertical, try doing horizontal. Um, just testing the different mediums that I like. And I think the other reason why I would say that is, especially if you want to be a filmmaker, I pull a lot of inspiration from a lot of other art. And I used to draw, I used to like, I play piano. And it's kind of in a culmination of all those things that allow me to have like a creative process when I'm writing for films. But as like a creative in general, I think just like finding and testing other things that you've never got to experience might open up doors for you. And then it also might just help you identify that you wanted to be a painter the whole time or if you wanted to be a filmmaker the whole time, right? Like I kind of did, at least in film, I tried to do every single aspect of film only to come to find that I really wanted to direct. But it allowed me to have a language as a director to where I could speak to the VFX artist, I could speak to the composer, I could speak to the actors, like so I think just like trying a bunch of different things is what I would say, especially when you're younger. It's like, don't be afraid just to like try things that you think that you might be bad at, then you might find that you're really good at them. Um, and then just do it because you love it. I think that's the other problem is that as an artist, you get into you need to make money with your art. But I think that there's a lot of other paths that you could go down and make sure that art always stays your passion and your hobby. It doesn't have to necessarily always be your job. Um, so just making sure that you distinguish the two sometimes helps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, very cool. Switching gears a little bit. You I know this isn't your first time on a podcast. I know you at least were on Created to Create a little while ago. Um, and in that podcast, you talked a little bit about how the integration between your religious beliefs and your creative process weren't initially merged. Can you talk about how those two things kind of came together?
Yeah, I think as I grew, obviously in my faith, it kind of started to affect my craft. Because I always grew up like I grew up in a Christian family, but I kind of tell people that I don't know if I was necessarily like fully a Christ follower until college. Um, because it kind of started becoming my choice. I started to really research and understand that the gospel message was true. But I think the more that I started to press into the way that God designed me and the way that I wanted to tell stories, it kind of started to bleed into my creative process a little bit more. Um, and I think when sorry, I have a dog running by.
No.
Um, I think when I really started to lean into my faith a little bit more, I started to identify the difference between like making art for myself versus making art for the kingdom. But at the same time, understanding that God just like wants us to be really good at our craft. And that doesn't always necessarily mean that like I have to go out and tell the blatant Christian story. But the way that I write is obviously going to be have theological integrations with the way that I write. Um, so I think the more that I just started stepping in my faith, the more I wanted to figure out a way to infuse morals and the way that our world functions, like being honest about our world, basically is like what I started coming to is like, I feel like really, really good writing is really honest. And so if I'm going to be really honest and if I believe that Christ is true, then I'm going to look at the things that Christ talked about. And if what he says is true, then I can be a better writer when it comes to my stories because I'm talking about what is true in our world. So I think that's kind of where the merge started to happen, especially as a world builder. Like I'm creating my own worlds and stuff like that. But um, I think you have to base your world still based off of something that we understand in our own universe. So I think that's kind of where the merger started to happen. I think there's a lot more to that, but I think
Sure.
that's kind of what I've been seeing.
Yeah, and I bring this up to tie us back to advice for young filmmakers because I feel like at least personally the process of starting to create can be so exciting, but can also make you really like too excited about yourself and about the things that you can do, and it can become self-involved. I'm sure it's not that way for everyone. How do you kind of separate the ego from the art?
I don't. Terrible at it. um, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't think that there's like a straightforward answer for it, but I do think that we as creatives can be so it's hard because as like a director or somebody that's leading the charge, you have to be involved in what you're doing and you kind of have to be like, this is what I see as the vision for what I do. But I don't know if that necessarily always means that you have to like put your foot down and say that it's my way or the highway. I think that great art, at least from my perspective, has come from surrounding myself with really, really good people that also have really good ideas that help my ideas become better. So taking up a heart posture that I don't have all the answers all the time. Um, but also from like a Christian perspective, I think God gave me the gifts that I have, and remembering that the opportunity that I have before me has come from Him and the people that He's put in my life. And the more I can put myself in that seat, the more I'm creating out of thankfulness and out of wanting to worship through my art and less so I just want to do this thing because I want everybody to look at how great I am.
Mm,
And so I think that's also kind of going to your other question too, is another aspect of like how my faith has blended into the stuff that I make, where I hope that people look at what we do and say that it's really, really good. But that way I can kind of revert the conversation to be like, yeah, how great is God for all the stuff that he's given us? Um, so I think that
mm,
maybe that's one aspect. There's probably other ways to approach that for sure. But I think just knowing where all the stuff has come from in the first place makes you more humble as you're going into it, right? It's like I'm only here because God put me where I'm at. Uh,
mm.
and so I can either choose to uh, take it all for myself and say, "Look how great I am," or I can say, "Wow, look at how great God is, and look at how awesome all the other people are that have helped make this thing work." Um, and that's why I like film so much too, is just because it's so collaborative, right? It touches
Yeah,
the person.
yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I feel like the collaborative nature of film could be a good reminder too about the way that God is working through all of these people, and that they're all bringing uh, something that is like good and true and beautiful to the table, um, which I think is really beautiful as well. You mentioned how as a filmmaker, just because you're a filmmaker that's a Christian, it doesn't mean you need to um, I don't know how to phrase this. Make like blatantly Christian art. You know, you don't need to be painting the Last Supper to count as a Christian artist. Uh, and I have a quote from Martin Luther. Luther said, "The Christian shoemaker does his duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship." Do you feel like that kind of resonates with what you were saying before?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's the same thing where it's like Paul was a tent maker, right? He was a really good tent maker, but he was also a minister, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think God just calls us to do good work, and then through that work, it's like, can you be a light? I think the thing that helped me change my perspective, at least in the industry, because we went to Biola, and I think the question that a lot of the students had was like, how do I integrate Christianity into what I'm doing? And I think it was when I shifted my perspective towards, okay, I was placed in this industry right now, and I could be placed in a different industry in a different part of my life. But if God
Mm-hmm.
places me here, how can I impact the people around me while I'm doing my craft? And then when it comes to the art itself, I think I've kind of taken an approach where it's like, I don't need to go make the Last Supper or Jesus dying on a cross or the next great Chosen. I like Chosen.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it goes back to what I was saying about like what's true in our world, right? Like if you honor good and evil is evil and good is good, like that's why I love Lord of the Rings so much, is because it even portrays evil as evil and good as good. And like sure, Tolkien had a lot of inspiration from the Bible as he's writing this stuff, but he wasn't blatantly saying like Jesus or saying like, this is from the Bible. And yet we can all resonate on a level where it's like we understand that sacrificing for the person to you or sacrificing for your friend is a good thing to do. And
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't necessarily have to just be blatantly from that's coming from the Bible and coming from what's true in our world, anyways. And it's like Jesus was a storyteller, he told parables so that we could relate to our surroundings and our world. And I think that's more of the approach I started taking was, okay, if I'm going to write a fantasy, how can I still relate to our world about what's good? And through fantasy as a tool, how can I actually break down those barriers that, like in our world, if I came up to you and said, hey, do you want to talk about like God and religion? People might be like, I don't really want to talk about that. Versus if I could put Jesus's morals from the Sermon on the Mount into a really epic fantasy world, now I can talk about that without the awkwardness of being like, you want to talk about religion? I can be like, you see that scene? That scene was so cool. And it's a commentary on XYZ, right? And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the way I started to approach stuff. So I agree with that quote where I think
Yeah.
that there's different ways to do it. But also making a blatant Jesus movie or The Chosen is also a great way to do it. So
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It seems like I love what you said about it kind of removes the barriers because like that's the brilliance of someone like Tolkien or Lewis, where it's like that's a story that resonates with everyone across religious and ethnic boundaries. It's a story about good and evil, and so it's a tale that pertains to morality, but it doesn't feel like it's like sticking it in your face. It just feels so natural. Yeah, that's really cool. Um, do you feel like do you feel like you're able to find inspiration in the Bible? You kind of talked a little bit about that before, about communicating truth, which is God's truth. How do you feel like that tangibly plays out as you're sitting down to write a script?
I think the more that I've been growing in my faith, the best that I can, the more I've been going towards reading the Bible or writing stuff through the lens of the Bible the best that I can.
Hmm.
And I do take a lot of inspiration from that. And I think that the worlds that we're building or the scripts that we're trying to write, I will try to take inspiration from epic story. I mean, the Old Testament is just littered with so like epic stories, man. Like,
Yeah.
regardless if you're a Christian or not, like they're just cool stories when you really start to understand them. And so, like, looking at some of, like, I guess the biblical heroes or legends in the Old Testament is kind of like where I've started being like, okay, what's the story of David? What's the story of Moses? How can I take that story and rewrite that in a way that's in a fantasy world? Or how can I take the story of David and understand what's going on in the story of David and apply it to what we're doing? And it's also interesting because vice versa, the more I'm trying to do that, the more I'm actually learning about what the actual stories in the Bible really represent. Like, we were
Hmm.
doing a story about David and Goliath, and I was always under the impression that, like, David was the underdog and Goliath was the big major bad guy. But you come to read that Goliath really is the underdog and David wasn't afraid at all. It was more about whose God was the right God. And so I think as I've been going and writing these scripts and going to scripture, it's kind of been like a twofold thing where I'm trying to write stories through the Bible, but in trying to do so, I'm actually learning more about the Bible, which is really cool. Um, and then another approach I've actually been really excited about, and I kind of want to see if other writers in the world will start doing this, but I started learning what a chiasm is in the Bible, like chiastic
Right.
structure. And I
Hmm.
started writing some of my stories in a chiastic structure, coming to find that it's like a really cool new way to approach story that still aligns with the way that we like to hear story, but also just feels like it has a really cool depth to it. So we've been
Hmm.
writing some stories in a chiastic manner, like Genesis has, and some of the other stories in the Bible do. So
What is that? I mean, without going like Blake Snyder like really breaking it down. What does it mean for a story to be in a chiastic structure?
if you go study, at least, I mean, there's chiasms actually all throughout the entire Bible, which is really cool, and I never knew that. And that's how a lot of the ancient writers for the biblical narrative would write, is through a chiastic structure. But the easiest way to put it is like A B A. So you're always mirroring each other. So if you have something that's happening in the beginning, then you have something that mirrors that at the end. But the thing that's at the center is the core of the message. That's where your character is learning something. So you
Hmm.
look at the the story of Genesis, and the sentence that's right in the center of him creating all of this stuff is the word rest. And so rest is at the center, and that's kind of the core for creatives to look at in Genesis, is that God is creating all this stuff. But at the center, where the bulk of this message comes from, is he's telling you to rest. And so that it's
Hmm.
really, really cool. So that's like, there's a lot more to a chiastic structure, but that's a
Sure.
basic way of looking at it. It's like the first stuff should mirror the last stuff, and then whatever your core principle is should be at the center.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'm working right now at a church with a pastor who used to be a screenwriter. And I can't remember who he wrote for. It was someone that is like a house name. It might have been like Universal or something, but he used to write a lot. And he said that he's like taken the time to break down Bible stories and to see the way in which they will kind of like map onto story structure really well. Which I think is so interesting that the way that we would talk about the structure of a good story then also maps on to Bible stories. Um, what how has, kind of writing helped you appreciate the Bible more? And I ask this because I feel like in a way, lots of people can, especially if they grew up with the Bible, can feel like the Bible kind of reads in a dull manner, where there can be a lot of like repetition at points, even in books that are more narrative, like Judges, or I think
Numbers.
I was yeah, Numbers, or like Kings. I think every chapter in Kings ends with like something along the lines of like, and the rest of this king's story, is it not written in the chronicles of the kings of Israel? And you're like, oh my gosh, do they need to write this like in every chapter? um so how can we, appreciate the Bible more through like modern storytelling?
I think it kind of goes to what I was saying before, is like the more that I was diving into writing my own stuff and looking at the Bible, it's so interesting because like the Bible is something where it's, my sister always says this, and I'm pretty sure a bunch of other apologists have said this, but it's like the Bible is so shallow and the gospel is so shallow that anybody can stand in its waters, but it's so deep that you can get lost in its depths. And
Mm,
I kind of find that to be more and more true when I have a heart posture and a mind ready to sit down, because the way the ancient writers wrote a lot of this stuff was it like an onion or layers that you need to sit and reread and peel back to find the core of what they're really trying to talk about. Because Jesus even says, like, right, or seek and you shall find, like wisdom is given to those who seek it. And so when you go and read the Bible, I think it's like really trying to get yourself in that heart posture of being like, okay, I'm ready to like sit and try to actually investigate through the writers. And to me, at least, like that's where the excitement started to come when I started reading the Bible more, was like, oh, when I can actually really sit and read this stuff, messages and ideas really start to come full force. And it kind of makes you appreciate the stories of the Bible a little bit more. So that's just what excites me about it. I do know, like, I grew up as, again, in a Christian household, and so you hear like the same Bible stories 100 times over, and you're like, okay, I get it. This is kind of boring. But I
mm,
think it's when you can really sit down and have a heart posture to be ready to sit and learn and dig. Like it's not a fantasy book that you just are entertained. It's not an entertainment book. It's a
mm.
book that is trying to cut to the core of who we are in our hearts and our minds and the way that we perceive things. So it's going to take a little bit longer to obtain the I don't know, the fruit of what the word's really trying to tell you. So
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's very cool. um and so I have a question for you, as living as a Christian who's a filmmaker in LA. There are stereotypes, and well, we'll get to that in a minute. There are stereotypes about like, oh, the way that Christians may or may not be treated in Hollywood. Um, and I was kind of uh, I believe the stereotypes were true kind of until I got to Biola, and I got to work on just like some regular professional sets as a PA or whatever. And I just found that none of my experiences align with kind of stereotypes that might be perpetuated by industry outsiders. And not to say that there's never been any merit to any of those stories, but do you think there's any truth in like, oh, people won't like you if you're a Christian in Hollywood, or do you think that that's at least largely a myth?
I I think that the answer to that could be a whole topic on its own.
Mm,
I think that the world of LA is not as dark as I thought it was growing up either.
mm,
And come to find that I have found some of like the most amazing and kind-hearted people on the planet, and also a lot of Christians out here as well pursuing
mm,
film. I It would be naive to say that there aren't political and religious agendas in certain companies and certain pockets of our industry, just like any industry. Um, and so I have seen both sides of the coin, where I would
mm.
say that more often than not, when you are a kind-hearted person, regardless of your beliefs, you can sit in a room with other people and you're fine. And it's
Yeah.
it's really not as like they all hate you because you're a Christian. It's like that's not. But I do know that there are subsects of the industry that are trying to tell a different story than Christians are trying to tell. And
Mm,
so you do have to kind of be aware of who's at the helm of what is being made and created, because they're going to try to tell a different story than maybe Christians are.
Mm,
However, I think where like the baby Christian syndrome, or like the mom at home that doesn't really understand LA and it's like they're just going to eat you alive out there, is that kind of like what I was saying before, is that if you're a truthful storyteller and you're working with other people that want to create stories that are true and honest, you're going to align probably more than you're going to disalign with people, right? It's like
mm,
we all believe in human rights. We all believe in being kind to one another. We all believe in these core values that, regardless of if you believe in Jesus or not, you still abide by.
mm,
Um, and I think that that's more true than anything else I've seen. Even when I
mm,
work with people that might not have the same belief system, we do believe on those core things. And when we tell stories, maybe it's not coming from somebody that's a believer or telling the story of Jesus, but they're talking about brokenheartedness, and I can relate to that too.
right.
That's what I have found is more so to be true, is that we actually align more on the stories that we trying to tell, and what we agree on. We probably agree on more than we disagree on. So
Right.
that's like my general answer I can give.
Sure, sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And yeah, I feel like, and I know you've had the opportunity to work closely with people who aren't Christian, and I wish I could say that I did more. I think I largely got stuck in and around the Biola bubble. Um, but I do think, yes, um, I almost wanted to say like I was surprised. I feel like I shouldn't have been surprised at all. We're all human. But I was surprised in a good way that like at least on the set that I was on, there wasn't really friction ever over that ever. So yeah, we're running out of time. What is next for you? What's coming in the next year for action and uh, social jump and kind of the sub companies?
Right now we're working on Fuel the Fire, which is our festival August 2nd. So if anybody wants, you go buy tickets. It's on our Instagram. That is at a culmination of all the network that we've built, both Christian and non-Christian, making films in the industry and try to make narratives. So that's August 2nd. And then actually this week we're shooting a pilot for a show that we're making called Knight and Squire. It's gonna be a fantasy comedy. So we're doing that this week. And then over the summer it's gonna just be a lot of development for trying to pitch movies. That's kind of it.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. And where can people go to find things that you or your companies have made?
Website actionstudios.tv is probably where a lot of our stuff is going to live. And then launching the YouTube channel, which is also Action Studios. And then we're just on Instagram a lot right now. So Action Studios TV or Jace Hardwick is where a lot of our
Okay.
stuff lives right now. Of
Okay. Very cool. Well, Jace, thank you for taking the time to come on and talk today.
course. Thanks for having me.